This is a 2003 Aston Martin Vanquish, and it is quite simply one of the most beautiful modern cars in existence. All modern Aston Martins are attractive, but I happen to think this one is particularly gorgeous. I think this is the most beautiful Aston Martin since the 60s. When this car was new, back in 2003, the starting price was $222,000, which translates to around $300,000 in today's money. These days, the average asking price for a Vanquish from this era on AutoTrader is around $85,000, which seems like a pretty good deal for the most beautiful modern Aston Martin. But there's just one problem. The Vanquish came with a terrible transmission. It was an early sequential automatic, and it was lurchy and awkward and slow to shift and uncomfortable, and it kind of ruined the whole car. Fortunately, Aston Martin realized this was an issue, and recently they have created a program where owners can send their Vanquish back to the factory, have the old automatic ripped out, and have a true 3-pedal manual transmission installed for a cost of around $50,000. And that's exactly what happened to this car. The crappy old automatic is gone, and instead, this car has a true 3-pedal manual transmission. So what you're looking at here is one of the most beautiful modern cars with a timeless manual transmission. And there's more to it, of course. Under the hood is a 6-liter V12 that makes 460 horsepower and 400 pound-feet of torque. And it's also impossible to forget this car's role in the James Bond movie Die Another Day, where it's involved in a chase on ice with a Jaguar XKR. So anyway, today I've borrowed this Vanquish from a viewer here in New Jersey, and I'm going to show you around it and show you all of the quirks and features of my favorite Aston Martin. Then I'm going to take it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Vanquish experience, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of the cheapest cool British sports cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now, I want to start by talking about the manual swap, because to me, that's the most interesting part about this car. How often have you heard of a factory manual swap, let alone on a 6-figure supercar? I have right here the invoice for the manual swap, and it is absolutely massive. The original owner had it done. The current owner bought it after it had already been done. This is like a 12-page invoice to cover all of the parts and labor necessary for the manual swap. And you can see at the very end, $33,300 is the amount billed. We believe that's in pounds. That's like $45,000, plus it doesn't include shipping to and from England to the factory where they actually did the manual swap. So figure like $50,000 or $60,000 all in to convert this car to a stick shift. Now, most of the pages of this go into all of the parts necessary to do the manual swap, including stuff that costs 12 cents, little screws and washers. But my favorite part is on the first page. It talks about labor, and it says labor, carry out manual gear shift conversation. They build that at 62 hours of labor at 156 pounds an hour for a total of 9,700 pounds to convert this car to a stick shift. The rest was all parts. It is an absolutely crazy thing to see this invoice and to see a car that was converted to stick shift by the factory in 2015, 12 years after it was made in the first place. It's a very unique setup. Now, next I want to talk about the mechanics of the manual swap, especially as it relates to the interior, since it isn't as simple as just sticking a stick shift in the middle. There are a couple of interesting things that had to happen. First off, they removed the paddle shifters from the steering column, and frankly, you can't even really tell that they were ever there. That means they replaced the leather wrapping over the steering column and put on a new one that doesn't have any holes for paddle shifters. Maybe even more incredible, the original Vanquish with the automatic has little buttons up here in the center control stack above the climate controls that say P, R, and D that allow you to shift into gear with the automatic. In this car, not only have those buttons been removed, but you can't tell they were ever there in the first place. And that means they had to refinish the entire center control stack with new leather trim that covered up any evidence that those buttons ever existed. And it gets even crazier. Obviously, they had to stick a clutch pedal in the driver's footwell since this car originally came with only 2 pedals. So the manual swap also included sticking in a clutch pedal. And finally, you have the actual manual transmission lever. They've placed it in a cup holder. This was a cup holder originally in the actual Vanquish with an automatic. In this car, the cup holder is gone and the manual transmission has been put in its place. Frankly, I would rather have the manual than a spot to put my drink. Of course, there's also tons of mechanical stuff that has to happen under the skin. When you think about all that, it starts to make sense why there's a 12-page invoice and a $50,000 cost. The manual swap even made a change to the gauge cluster. There's a little circle to the left of the speedometer that in the automatic cars tells you what gear you're in. In the manual cars, it doesn't need to tell you what gear you're in, obviously, because you know what gear you're in when you shift into gear. So they had to change that so that it doesn't display when you go into gear, but it still displays for reverse. So the manual cars have a different software for that little circle to the left of the speedometer. It was all done very professionally. Of course, it better have been for that price. Now, beyond the manual swap, there are a couple of other interesting items in this interior. I'm going to start with all the Ford bits and pieces. Now, when this car was built, Ford owned Aston Martin. It was part of Ford's premier automotive group that also included Volvo and Jaguar and Land Rover. And so this car has some Ford parts in it. The turn signal and wiper stalks are this cheap plastic. They look like they came straight out of a Ford Focus. The climate controls, I think, are lifted directly from the Jaguar models of the time.
Maybe even crazier, the climate control vents look like they're directly out of a Volvo from this era. At the time, Volvo was also owned by Ford, and you can see the characteristic Volvo font with that 0 on the climate control vent slider. They didn't even bother to change it.
Same deal with the window switches, this little plastic window switch that looks like it's right out of a Ford or something like that. But to me, the craziest bit of Ford cost cutting is the keyless entry fob. Take a look at this. If you've had a 1990s Ford Explorer, this fob is familiar to you. It's the exact same one that Ford uses, except for the Aston Martins, they've painted it silver to emphasize how premium it is, even though it is otherwise identical to the key fob you'd get if you had a 97 Explorer Sport. With that said, there are also some very beautiful items in this interior befitting an Aston Martin. For example, the headliner is this beautiful suede with this cool diamond pattern. Same with the sun visor. It's also this beautiful suede. It looks and feels really nice. You also have some high-end finishes like Aston Martin engraved in both the driver and passenger door on the door pulls. It's very, very beautiful. I also like the door sill plates that say V12 Vanquish, just sort of screwed in there. That also is a very cool, very upscale luxury look befitting a car like this. Then there's the fuel door. You pop open the fuel door and you see that the door itself is this really nice aluminum, and even the fuel cap looks good, even though you almost never look at it except when you're just filling the car up with gas. They could have cheaped out there, but they didn't. Another item that I think looks really nice in this car is the engine start button. It is this bright red button right in the middle of the center control stack. The interesting thing about the engine start button in this car is you don't just get in and push it. Instead, you get in, turn the key like in a normal car, and then you push the engine start button. It's sort of a gimmick since you're turning the key anyway, but I have to admit I find it really cool to press the engine start button bright red and right in the middle, and so I kind of get why it's there. It does make the whole experience just a little cooler. Something that doesn't make the experience a little cooler, back to the climate controls. They operate just like normal climate controls, except every time you push anything, it beeps. So you press a button, beep, you change the temperature, beep, you can take a listen. That's just tremendously annoying. I've been in a few cars that do this, and I have to say, if you work for an automaker in the buttons and sounds department, please never do that. One item right above the climate controls that is really cool is the clock. You can see that it has this very nice look to it, obviously, but I really like the plus minus buttons. They're very hard to press, and for some reason they just sort of add an air of classiness to the whole thing. You don't adjust the clock with some electronic thing. Instead, it's these dedicated plus minus buttons surrounded in aluminum. And speaking of an air of classiness, let's discuss the gauge cluster. You can see all the gauges, the RPM, the speedometer. It's this really high-end font. It's sort of not what you'd expect from a stick shift 460 horsepower V12 supercar, but this is also an Aston Martin, and so there's a touch of luxury to that font choice. By the way, going back to things that beep annoyingly, here's an interesting one. Every time you put the car in reverse, it dings at you to let you know that you're in reverse. That's another quirk of this car that I find rather unusual. And here's another one. Right below the climate controls, there's this little silver finished piece that says Aston Martin on it. You push it thinking it's going to be a storage tray, and in fact it is a storage tray, but it's incredibly tiny. I think it has room for like 2 total credit cards. But nonetheless, if you want a place to store 2 total credit cards, your Vanquish has it. Now, next we move back to the gauge cluster with the beautiful font. Now, there are a couple of interesting items worth noting in the gauge cluster. One other interesting item is that you can easily switch from miles to kilometers. You press a little button to the left of the steering wheel, and it instantly switches your trip odometer or whatever from miles to kilometers. Now, the funny thing is when you switch it from miles to kilometers, it also switches automatically from gallons to liters. Even though the button only says miles to kilometers on it, it knows that if you're going into kilometers, you probably want everything to be metric. Now, that little display shows all of the usual stuff. It shows fuel economy, instant fuel economy. It shows your trip odometer, average speed. It also shows one interesting item. That would be gallons of fuel used. I guess since your last reset or since your last fill up, it shows you how many gallons you've used, which is something I've never seen in any other car and something that, frankly, I have no interest in knowing about. Next up, we move on to some other interesting items in this interior. I'm going to start with the seat controls. They're over on the side of the seat where they are in most cars. The weird thing about this one is in this car, they're absolutely atrocious. Instead of being in the shape of a seat like most cars are so that you can tell exactly what you're moving, in this car, they're all the same size and the same shape and right next to each other. So when you go and adjust your seat, you have no idea what you're actually moving forward or backward, which isn't really the smartest idea, but then Aston Martin probably wasn't focused on ergonomics more than anything. Next up, moving on to the glove box, a couple of interesting things in here, one of which is there's a pen holder that actually contains a pen. I've been in many cars owned by many people, and I've never seen anyone actually use the pen holder for its intended purpose. Also in this glove box, there's a little holder for a notepad, and it contains the Aston Martin notepad that you got with this car. The interesting thing about this particular notepad is it's tremendously small in order to fit into that spot. So the notes are like the size of Post-it notes, but nonetheless, it's better than not having any notes at all. And you can use your pen to write in it. Now there's one other item to cover in the glove box, but first I want to show you the stereo. It looks like a fairly normal stereo. It's just a regular radio. Kind of looks old school because this car's 15 years old, nothing special. Now, you go into the owner's manual in the glove box, and you can see that on page 57, it gets into the navigation system. As it turns out, that stereo isn't just a stereo, it's also a navigation system, and that tiny little screen is supposed to give you directions and tell you where to go. This seems like the crappiest navigation system I could ever imagine in any automobile, but Aston Martin must have felt pressure at the time they created a car this expensive. We gotta put in a navigation system. Unfortunately, that's how they chose to do it. It doesn't seem to be working. I press nav and nothing happens, which frankly is probably a good thing. Next up, I want to cover the back seats. Unbelievably, this car has back seats. I actually didn't even know that until I got here, and I looked back there, and lo and behold, there are some back seats. They're actually the smallest back seats I have ever seen. Here you can see with the front seat in the normal position, I moved the backrest forward, and this is how much legroom there is, literally zero. I've been in every exotic car back seat you can imagine. I have never seen back seats this small. Nonetheless, I will now attempt to climb in the back seats as I usually do, which is actually kind of a difficult process. You pull a little latch, it moves the seat back forward, but then you actually have to press the power seat control and wait for the seat to move all the way forward. It takes like 20 seconds, but then again, Aston Martin must have known that no one would ever get in these back seats. But now I will. Maybe. Okay, so now I'm back here with the front seat as far forward as possible and the front backrest forward, and I still don't have room. Certainly not enough room to even put the backrest back, let alone move the seat back, and I can't sit back. My head is up against the ceiling. I have never seen such restrictive back seats in any car. And when you're back here, the back seats have no quirks because they have nothing. They're literally just seats. There isn't even climate control vents back here. You can't even roll down the windows. Aston Martin knew no one would ever sit back here, so there's not a single feature of these back seats aside from the fact that they exist and they have seat belts. One interesting item in the back, though, you can see on the rear shelf, there are a couple of interesting things. There's a bunch of speakers, which is kind of odd. There's a lot of them, but also there is child seat anchors. This car has child seat anchors for these tiny back seats. I promise you that no one in Vanquish history has ever used those child seat anchors, and if they have, I bet they regretted it deeply, because I can't imagine trying to stuff a child seat back here. Next we move up front, where there are a couple of interesting quirks worth noting, one of which is under the hood. First, take a look at the glorious Aston Martin V12 in this car. It is very cool looking. I also like the fact that it has a plaque of the guy who built the engine. All Aston Martins have that. It's not particularly unusual. AMGs have it too. The thing I like about this, though, is the guy's name is Stuart Bull. That's exactly the name of the kind of guy I want to be building my Aston Martin engines. Oh yes, Stuart Bull, Aston Martin engine builder. It's just the perfect name for the job. A couple other interesting things up here. The headlights. The headlights are very interesting. They're just these two round circles, just like a lot of cars have, but they're placed inside sort of this giant container housing them. It's a kind of an odd look, especially by modern standards. Next up, the other interesting lighting thing up here is the fog lights. They're housed in this giant circle in the bumper, and they give the car kind of a cool look in front. Interestingly, the fog light itself is only the lower half of the circle. The upper half of the circle is the front turn signal, but then also there's this tiny little triangular light that shares this circle with the other two. I don't know why they bothered to include that. It doesn't provide any additional illumination at all, but for some reason it's in there. Next up, I want to talk about one other interesting detail on the outside. You can see this car has a fender vent, like a lot of Aston Martin models and other luxury cars of this era. There's also this silver line running through the fender vent that makes it look cool, but here's the really cool thing. Aston Martin decided the car looked better if the line was a little bit longer, and so they actually extended the line onto the door with a different piece so that the door can still open. That is attention to detail. They could have just stopped it here and cheaped out and saved the money, but they felt that it needed 4 more inches to really complete the look, and so they did that. Even though I'm sure it adds cost and complexity in production to stick that little silver thing on the door and have it line up, they did it anyway because beauty was this car's goal. And I really mean that beauty was this car's goal. I truly believe this is one of the most beautiful modern cars. Just the whole shape of it is absolutely perfect. All modern Astons look good, but this one was just perfect. One good example of sort of a focus on styling in this car is right here. Now, most cars that have hip lines on the back over the rear wheels, they start them beyond the door because it's expensive to integrate that into the door and it changes the shape. But Aston Martin decided this car would look better if the line started just 3 inches into the door, and so as you can see, they had to bulge out the door, which must have added a lot of complexity and cost in production, just to preserve this beautiful hip line on this car, which in my opinion, overall is one of the best lines in modern automotive design. And they could have made it crappier and made the door flat and then started the hip line, but they didn't. They did this, and it just looks so good. And so those are the quirks and features of the Aston Martin Vanquish. Now it's time to get behind the wheel and drive it. All right, I'm driving the Vanquish. Now this is a bit of a special video for me. This is the last video I filmed while still living on the East Coast. I really wanted to come and shoot this manual Vanquish before I moved. It's hard to find a manual swapped one. There's probably only a dozen in the country, maybe less. The very first thing you realize, and it's an unfortunate reality with this car, the pedal box is really close together. I have big feet, but when I drive a Lotus Elise, I can make it work better than I can in this car. I mean, in this car, ultimately, there were 2 pedals, and then they stuck a 3rd pedal in there. It wasn't designed for it, and so more than once already, I have accidentally pressed the brake with my toe when going for the clutch, which is not a good sensation. I will say I've been driving it now for about 10 minutes. I'm getting used to it. Like, I'm pressing the clutch with my my toe to keep the rest of my foot on that side of the clutch, so it doesn't press the brake. But if you have big feet and you're not really paying attention, you can definitely push the wrong pedal. One interesting thing about this car is driving it around, the exterior is more beautiful than the interior. Sometimes I drive cars where the interior is just as beautiful and as special. This car is not that. The interior has some Ford, some Jaguar, some shared parts. In fact, I'm actually kind of jealous of all the people I'm seeing on the street because they get to see this car. The drive is actually fairly comfortable. I'm driving it right now on sort of normal city roads, whatever. It's actually surprisingly comfortable. The sound on the outside of the car is pretty good. Not as insane as some of the crazy V12 cars today. From inside though, you don't hear much. It was definitely more of a muted car. That was the intent. The clutch feels good. The gear lever feels great. The problem is, it's just that space that you have there in the footwell. All right, really flooring it here. Wow. Yeah, it moves. Wow. Man. is quick. And actually, I take back what I said before about the noise not being so great. One interesting thing, you can see in the camera that is the third brake light. It really comes up high and it really limits visibility. It is actually hard to see behind me. Wow. Yeah, it is. This is actually a fast car. And the thing is, it sounds great. And I'll tell you, there's something about... This is a great road. There's something about rowing the gears in a V12 that's just phenomenally powerful. There's nothing more powerful than shifting your own in a 12-cylinder car. And according to the trip odometer, I am getting 10 miles per gallon, which strikes me as about what I'd expect. And so that's the 2003 Aston Martin Vanquish. This car is truly gorgeous, absolutely beautiful, one of the most attractive modern cars in existence. In an era in the early 2000s when everyone else was going retro to make their cars look good, Aston Martin was like, nah, forget that crap, we're just gonna make a beautiful car without resorting to anything from the past. But beyond the styling, this car has a huge engine, it's really fast, it's fun to drive, and the manual swap completes the package. And for around $85,000, it's a fairly reasonable price for a car that I think will go down as an icon of automotive design from this era. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Sorry about those microphone crackles. Anyway, starting with the weekend categories and styling, this one's easy. The Vanquish gets a 10 out of 10. It's truly breathtaking. Acceleration 0 to 60 is 4.4 seconds, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Handling is fine. They're nothing special. It's a relatively large car. It handles more like a tourer than a sports car, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor, though, is high. There's a sheer joy you get from driving a manual V12 and listening to that soundtrack as you row through the gears. It's hard to explain, but it's easy to score. It gets an 8 out of 10. Cool factor is pretty high as the Vanquish is becoming highly appreciated for its styling, and the manual swap on this one helps. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 38 out of 50. As for the daily categories, starting with features, the Vanquish is reasonably well equipped for its time period, but it gets a 4 out of 10 by modern standards. Comfort is fine, not amazing, not awful, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is only okay. The owner tells me it's relatively reliable, but the interior quality is mediocre at best, though there are a few bright spots. I went back and forth on this between a 5 and a 6, but I decided to give it a 6 out of 10. I'm less generous on practicality. Even though most 4-seater sports cars get a 4, this thing's back seats are so pathetic, I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. Finally, there's value. I really think $85,000 is a great number for this car, especially with the manual swap. It's a bargain when you consider how beautiful it is, how it sounds, how it drives, and it gets an 8 out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 64 out of 100, and here's how it stacks up against other cars from its era. It loses to the exotic cars, the Carrera GT and the Ford GT, no surprise, but it beats out the Mercedes SLR, which is far more expensive but provides similar thrills. It also beats out the BMW Z8, which isn't quite as exciting or as fun as the Vanquish, though it's every bit as beautiful.
Oh,